The oil lamps were still burning when they found them. 3 lamps, arranged in a perfect triangle on the tunnel floor, their flames steady and bright, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn rock walls. But the men who had carried those lamps into the mountain were gone. Their tools lay scattered around the lights, picks and hammers and measuring chains dropped as if the workers had simply stopped mid-task and walked away. But there were no footprints leading out, no signs of struggle, no blood, and the lamps were still burning. After 4 days, that was impossible. The foreman knew it. The search party knew it. Those lamps held enough oil for maybe 6 hours of continuous burn, not 96. This happened on March 17th, 1893, deep inside the unfinished Hawk's Nest Tunnel in Fayette County, West Virginia. What foreman Thomas Aldrich would discover in the following week would force the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Company to abandon a $2 million construction project, dynamite both tunnel entrances shut, and bury all evidence of what they found in those dark passages beneath the new river gorge. And what you are about to hear is the truth. Reconstructed from Thomas Aldrich's private journal, documents that were supposed to have been destroyed, and testimony that was sealed by the state of West Virginia for 60 years. And before we descend into that cursed tunnel beneath Hawks Mountain, if you are drawn to these dark corners of American history, the cases that were buried, the mysteries that were erased, the stories they did not want told, you need to subscribe to Appalachian Shadows right now. Because every week I bring you a case like this from the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Something real in spirit, something disturbing, something that challenges what you thought you knew about what men will hide to protect their fortunes and their reputations. And this is one of the most inexplicable cases I have ever investigated. 3 experienced men who walked into a mountain and never walked out the same way. The Hawk's Nest Tunnel project began in 1891. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Company was expanding its network through the rugged mountains of West Virginia, pushing rails through terrain that had resisted development since the first European settlers arrived. The new River Gorge presented a particularly difficult challenge. The river carved a deep channel through solid rock, with sheer cliffs rising hundreds of feet on both sides. The only practical solution was to bore a tunnel straight through Hawks Mountain, a massive ridge that blocked the most direct route. The project was ambitious. The tunnel would stretch 3,200 feet through solid limestone and sandstone, emerging on the opposite side of the mountain where the river widened and the terrain became more manageable. It would save the railroad company years of construction time and hundreds of thousands of dollars, compared to the alternative of laying track around the gorge through dozens of miles of difficult mountain passes. Work began with great optimism. The company hired experienced tunnel workers, many of them immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Wales, who had worked on similar projects in Europe and in other parts of the United States. These were not novice laborers, but skilled professionals who understood the dangers of underground work and how to manage them. They knew about cave-ins, about poisonous gases that could accumulate in poorly ventilated spaces, about underground water that could flood a tunnel in minutes. By March of 1893, the tunnel was nearly 60% complete. Crews worked from both ends, drilling and blasting their way through the mountain, removing tons of rock every day. The work was dangerous, backbreaking, and constant. Men worked 12-hour shifts in near-total darkness, breathing air thick with rock dust, their ears ringing from the percussion of hammers and the thunder of dynamite charges. Thomas Aldrich was the day shift foreman. He was 42 years old, a veteran of railroad construction projects across 3 states. He had supervised the building of bridges, the laying of tracks through swamps and forests, and the excavation of 3 previous tunnels. He was a practical man, not given to superstition or flights of fancy. His journal entries from the early months of the project are matter of fact, recording daily progress, minor accidents, equipment failures, and the 1,000 small details that occupied the mind of a man responsible for keeping 70 workers alive in one of the most dangerous occupations in America. But beginning in late February of 1893, Aldrich's journal entries began to change. The tone shifted from routine documentation to something more uncertain, more troubled. He wrote about strange sounds in the tunnel, echoes that did not quite match the sounds that should have produced them. He mentioned that several workers had complained about feeling watched in the deeper sections, about seeing movement in the darkness beyond the reach of their lamps, about finding tools moved from where they had been left at the end of a shift. Aldrich initially dismissed these reports as the natural nervousness of men working in confined, dangerous spaces. Tunnels played tricks on the senses. The darkness was absolute, the silence between hammer strikes oppressive. It was easy for imagination to transform ordinary sounds and shadows into something sinister. He had seen this before on other projects, particularly among younger, less experienced workers. But then the accidents began. On February 23rd, a worker named Patrick Donnelly was struck by a falling rock during a routine shift. The rock was not large, perhaps 30 pounds, and it fell from a section of ceiling that had been inspected and deemed stable just hours earlier. It hit Donnelly on the shoulder, breaking his collarbone and putting him out of work for 6 weeks. The incident would have been unremarkable, just another industrial accident in a dangerous trade, except for what Donnelly said when they were carrying him out of the tunnel. He insisted that someone had pushed the rock. He said he had felt a hand on his back seconds before the rock fell, a hand that shoved him slightly forward, positioning him directly beneath the falling stone. When his fellow workers had turned their lamps to look, there was no one behind him. The tunnel wall was solid rock. There was nowhere for anyone to hide, no side passages in that section, no alcoves or gaps where someone could have stood. Donnelly's account was dismissed as the confused rambling of a man in shock and pain, but Aldrich noted it in his journal with a sentence that suggested he was not entirely certain. Patrick insists he was pushed. The men with him saw no one. I do not know what to think. 3 days later, on February 26th, another incident occurred. A crew of 6 men was working on expanding one of the ventilation shafts when all of their lamps went out simultaneously. This should have been impossible. Each lamp operated independently, and the chances of 6 separate flames extinguishing at precisely the same moment in relatively still air were astronomical. Yet it happened. The men were plunged into absolute darkness, not the dimness of a cloudy night, but the complete and total absence of light that exists only deep underground, where no ray of sunlight has ever penetrated. One of the workers, a man named Giovanni Rossi, later said that the darkness was so profound that he could not see his own hand when he held it directly in front of his face. He could have been blind for all the difference it made. They stood in that darkness for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. No one moved, terrified of stepping wrong and falling into one of the deep drill holes or walking into a tunnel wall. They called out to each other, confirming that everyone was still there, still safe, trying to keep panic from taking hold. And then they heard it. Footsteps, clear and distinct, the sound of boots on rock moving through the tunnel. Coming closer, but there was no accompanying light, no glow of a lamp carried by the approaching figure. Just footsteps in absolute darkness. The men shouted, asking who was there, what was happening. The footsteps stopped, and then the lamps reignited, all 6 of them flaring back to life simultaneously, just as they had gone out. There was no one else in the tunnel. The crew refused to work for the rest of that shift. Aldrich himself went down to investigate, checking the lamps, examining the ventilation shaft, looking for any rational explanation. He found nothing wrong with the equipment. The lamps were functioning perfectly. The ventilation was adequate. There was no accumulation of gases that might have extinguished the flames or caused hallucinations. In his journal that night, Aldrich wrote a longer entry than usual. He described the incident in detail, including the workers' testimony about the footsteps. He noted his own failure to find any reasonable explanation. And then he wrote something that would prove prophetic. There is something wrong with this tunnel. I cannot identify what it is, but I feel it when I go deep inside. A presence, a weight. as if the mountain itself is aware of us and resents our intrusion. Despite these troubling incidents, work continued. The railroad company had invested too much money to halt the project based on what they considered workers' superstitions and minor accidents. Aldrich pressed forward, implementing additional safety protocols, increasing the frequency of structural inspections, and trying to maintain morale among increasingly nervous crews. Then came March 13, 1893. The day the project changed forever. The tunnel had reached a depth where the two crews, drilling from opposite ends, should have been able to hear each other through the remaining rock. It was standard practice at this stage to begin careful coordination, ensuring that the two tunnels would meet precisely in the middle, creating one continuous passage through the mountain. But on March 13th, when the crew working from the eastern entrance drilled a small pilot hole to gauge the remaining distance, something unexpected happened. Instead of striking solid rock, the drill bit broke through into empty space. Air rushed through the hole with a sound like a wounded animal, a long, hollow moan that echoed through the tunnel and sent several workers scrambling backward in alarm. Aldrich was summoned immediately. He examined the hole carefully, holding a lamp close to the opening. The draft continued, cold air flowing out of the mountain with surprising force. He could not see anything through the small opening, just darkness beyond. He called for the drilling crew to carefully enlarge the hole, working slowly and methodically to avoid triggering a collapse. Over the next several hours, they expanded the opening to a gap roughly 3 feet in diameter, large enough for a man to squeeze through if necessary. And what they discovered was both exciting and deeply unsettling. They had not drilled into the western section of the tunnel as expected. Instead, they had broken through into a natural cave system, a vast network of underground chambers that ran through the heart of Hawks Mountain. This discovery presented both an opportunity and a problem. Natural caves could make tunnel construction easier if they ran in the right direction, eliminating the need to drill through solid rock. But they could also be unstable, prone to collapse, and potentially filled with poisonous gases or underground water. Aldrich needed to know exactly what they were dealing with. He sent word to the company headquarters in Charleston, describing the discovery and requesting guidance. The response came back within 2 days. The company wanted a full survey of the cave system. They wanted to know its extent, its stability, and whether it could be incorporated into the tunnel design. And they wanted the survey completed quickly, before construction delays cost them tens of thousands of dollars. Aldrich selected 3 men for the initial exploration. He chose experienced workers, men who had demonstrated courage and competence in difficult situations. The first was James Fletcher, 36 years old, a Welsh immigrant who had worked in coal mines since he was 14. Fletcher was small and wiry, perfect for squeezing through tight spaces, and he had an almost supernatural ability to sense structural weaknesses in rock. If anyone could evaluate the safety of the cave system, it was Fletcher. The second was William Brennan, 40 years old, an Irishman who had helped build railroad tunnels in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Brennan was the most experienced of the 3, a natural leader who remained calm in crisis situations. He had once talked a crew through a partial tunnel collapse, keeping 20 men alive until rescue teams could reach them. His steady nerves would be essential if anything went wrong in the unexplored caves. The third was Robert Hayes, 28 years old, the youngest of the group but also the strongest. Hayes was a Virginia native from the Shenandoah Valley, a mountain man who had grown up hunting and trapping in wilderness terrain. He knew caves, had explored dozens of them in his youth, and he could move through underground spaces with confidence that came from experience rather than recklessness. Wait. Think about this for a second. 3 experienced men, chosen specifically for their skills and temperament. Men who had faced danger before and emerged unscathed. Why would Aldrich send them into the cave on March 13th, but then report them missing just 4 days later? What happened in those 4 days that transformed a routine survey into a disaster? Drop a comment right now with your theory, because this detail It is going to matter at the end, and I want to see if anyone figures it out before we get there. The three men entered the cave system at 8 o'clock on the morning of March 13th. They carried oil lamps, coils of rope, chalk for marking their route, and enough supplies for 6 hours underground. The plan was simple. They would explore the main passages, map the general layout, check for structural hazards, and return by mid-afternoon to report their findings. It was a standard preliminary survey, the kind of work all three men had done many times before. Eldritch watched them squeeze through the opening in the tunnel wall and disappear into the darkness beyond. He noted the time in his journal, 8:07 in the morning. He would note another time that evening, 6:43 in the evening, the time when Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes emerged from the cave and walked back through the tunnel to the surface. But according to multiple witnesses who saw them exit the mountain that evening, something was wrong. The three men walked strangely, their movements stiff and mechanical. They did not respond to greetings from other workers. They did not speak to each other. They simply walked past everyone, left the construction site, and headed down the mountain trail toward the workers' camp 2 miles away. Aldrich called out to them, asking for their report. Fletcher turned to look at him, and Aldrich would later write that he had never seen such an expression on a human face before. Not fear, not pain, something else. Something he could not name, but that made his blood run cold. The three men did not return to the workers' camp that night. When their bunkmates woke the next morning and found their beds empty, they assumed the trio had risen early and returned to the tunnel. But when Aldrich arrived at the worksite at dawn, there was no sign of Fletcher, Brennan, or Hayes. Their personal belongings remained in their bunks. Their wages, which had been paid out just 2 days earlier, sat untouched in the camp office. They had simply vanished. Aldrich immediately organized a search. Crews combed the mountain trails, checked every building in the area, interviewed everyone who might have seen the three men after they left the tunnel the previous evening. Most workers reported seeing them walk past in that strange, silent manner. A few noticed that they had been heading away from the camp, up the mountain instead of down. But no one had actually seen them arrive at any destination. The search continued for 3 days without success. On March 17th, Aldrich made the decision to enter the cave system himself with a larger search party. Perhaps Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes had gone back into the caves. Perhaps they had found something during their initial exploration that required further investigation. Perhaps they were lost or injured somewhere in the darkness beneath the mountain. Aldrich selected 12 men for the search party. He wanted enough people to cover ground quickly, but not so many that they would be difficult to coordinate in confined spaces. They prepared carefully, carrying extra lamps, extensive rope, medical supplies, and enough food and water to sustain an extended search if necessary. They entered through the same opening that Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes had used 4 days earlier, and almost immediately they made the first disturbing discovery. Just beyond the opening on the floor of the cave were 3 oil lamps, burning, their flames steady and bright. The same lamps that Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes had carried into the darkness 96 hours earlier. Aldrich picked up one of the lamps, examining it closely. The reservoir was nearly empty, just a thin film of oil coating the bottom. By all logic, these lamps should have burned out within hours of being lit, yet here they were, still burning, impossibly burning, long after their fuel should have been exhausted. He looked around at his men. He saw his own confusion and unease reflected in their faces. Something was very wrong here, something that defied simple explanation. But they had come to find their missing colleagues, and they would not turn back because of impossible burning lamps. Aldrich gave the order to proceed. The search party moved deeper into the cave system, following a main passage that sloped gradually downward into the mountain's heart. The passage was natural, carved over millions of years by underground water, with smooth walls and a relatively level floor. It was wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, and the ceiling was high enough that no one needed to crouch. They had traveled approximately 200 feet when they found the first marker, Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes had been instructed to mark their route with chalk, drawing arrows on the walls to ensure they could find their way back. The first arrow pointed forward, indicating the direction the original survey team had traveled. It looked normal, exactly as expected. But then they found the second marker, and the third, and the fourth. The arrows continued, each one clearly drawn on the cave wall in white chalk. But something was wrong with them. The arrows did not point forward anymore. They pointed down, not angled toward the descending floor of the passage, but straight down, as if indicating something beneath the rock itself. Aldrich counted the markers as they progressed. Every 20 feet, another arrow. Every arrow pointing straight down. 16 arrows in total, all identical, all pointing toward the floor of the cave. It made no sense. If Fletcher and his team were marking their route, they should have drawn arrows, indicating the direction of travel, not arrows that pointed at the ground beneath their feet. The passage continued for another 100 feet before opening into a large chamber. The search party's lamps illuminated rough limestone walls, stalactites hanging from a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above, and a floor scattered with rubble from ancient rockfalls. It was a typical limestone cave formation, impressive in size, but not unusual for this region of West Virginia. What was unusual was what sat in the exact center of that chamber. 3 sets of tools, a pick, a hammer, and a measuring chain, arranged in a perfect triangle, the same tools that Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes had carried with them. Arranged with mathematical precision, each implement exactly equidistant from the others, the triangle's sides measured to the inch, and at each point of the triangle, one of those impossible burning lamps. The search party stood in silence, staring at this inexplicable arrangement. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft hiss of their own lamps and the distant, irregular drip of water somewhere in the darkness beyond. Eldridge felt the weight of the mountain above him, thousands of tons of rock pressing down, and for the first time in his long career, he felt genuine fear in an underground space. Where were Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes? Who had arranged their tools in this precise geometric pattern? And most importantly, why had those lamps been left burning in a way that violated every law of physics Aldrich understood? The answers to these questions lay deeper in the cave system, in chambers that no one had mapped, in passages that predated human presence in these mountains by millions of years, and in discoveries that would force the railroad company to make a decision that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Aldrich made a decision that he would question for the rest of his life. Instead of retreating and reporting what they had found, he ordered the search party to continue deeper into the cave system. His men needed him. Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes could still be alive, possibly injured, possibly lost in the labyrinth of passages that honeycombed the mountain. He could not abandon them based on nothing more than burning lamps and strangely arranged tools. But he also could not ignore the screaming warnings in his gut that told him to run. The search party left the chamber with its impossible triangle and moved into a passage that branched off to the west. The passage was narrower than the main route, forcing the men to walk single file, their lamps casting long shadows that danced and merged on the uneven walls. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of dripping water became more pronounced, echoing with a rhythm that almost sounded deliberate, almost sounded like speech. They had traveled perhaps 50 yards when one of the men in the rear of the line called out. His voice was tight with fear. "Mr. Aldrich, the lamps. Look at the lamps." Aldrich turned. Behind them, back toward the large chamber they had just left, the 3 burning lamps were visible through the narrow passage. Except they were moving, not floating or being carried, but sliding across the cave floor with smooth, deliberate motion, moving toward the passage entrance, moving toward the search party. Several men raised their voices in alarm. One started to bolt back the way they had come, but Aldrich grabbed his arm and held him in place. "Stay together," he commanded, his voice harder than he felt. "No one breaks ranks. We stay together." The 3 lamps reached the passage entrance and stopped. They sat there in perfect alignment, their flames burning bright and steady, illuminating the opening like three malevolent eyes staring into the darkness where the search party huddled. For a long moment, nothing else happened. The lamps simply burned, watching, waiting. Then one by one they went out. Darkness swallowed the chamber behind them. And in that darkness something moved. The sound was unmistakable, the scrape of something heavy being dragged across stone, accompanied by a wet, slithering quality that raised every hair on Aldrich's neck. "Move forward," he said quietly. "Quickly now. But stay together." The search party obeyed, walking as fast as they dared through the narrow passage, their own lamps held high, trying to see as far ahead as possible while simultaneously dreading what they might see. Behind them, the dragging sound continued, keeping pace with their movement, never getting closer but never falling behind either. The passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but with a feature that stopped every man in his tracks. In the center of the cave floor was a hole. Not a natural formation like a sinkhole or a collapsed section, but a deliberately excavated shaft, roughly circular, approximately 4 feet in diameter, descending straight down into absolute darkness. The edges of the hole were smooth and regular, showing clear evidence of tool marks. Someone had dug this shaft recently. Aldrich approached the edge and held his lamp over the opening. The light penetrated perhaps 15 feet before being swallowed by the darkness below. He picked up a loose stone and dropped it into the hole. The rock fell in silence for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, before finally striking something with a distant hollow thud. Deep. Very deep. And that was where they found the first body. It was not in the hole, but next to it. Fletcher. His body lay on its back with his arms at his sides and his eyes open, staring up at the cave ceiling. There was no visible injury, no blood, no sign of trauma. He looked as if he had simply laid down and died, except for his hands. Fletcher's hands were black. Not bruised or frostbitten, but actually black, as if charred or stained with something that had soaked into the skin. The blackness extended from his fingertips to his wrists, ending in a precise line where normal skin tone resumed. And his fingernails were gone. Not torn off or damaged, but completely absent, as if they had never existed. One of the search party members, a man named Peter Walsh, leaned down to check for a pulse. He touched Fletcher's neck, checking the carotid artery. Then he jerked his hand back with a gasp. "He is warm. Mr. Aldrich, he is still warm. His body is still warm." Impossible. Fletcher had been missing for 4 days. Even if he had died just hours ago, his body should be cold in the cave's chill air. But Walsh was not lying. Aldrich touched the body himself and confirmed it. Fletcher's skin was warm to the touch, as if he had been alive moments ago, as if the warmth of life had not yet faded. "We need to get him out of here," Aldrich said. "2 men stay with the body. The rest of us continue the search. Brennan and Hayes are still missing." But even as he gave the order, he knew they would find the other 2 men. He knew with terrible certainty that they would be arranged in some meaningful pattern, that their deaths would follow rules that made sense to whatever was in these caves, but made no sense to rational human minds. The search party split. 2 men remained with Fletcher's body, while Aldrich and the remaining 10 continued deeper into the cave system. The passage beyond the excavated hole descended steeply, requiring the men to brace themselves against the walls to avoid sliding on the smooth, water-worn stone. The temperature dropped noticeably, and their breath began to fog in the lamplight. They emerged into a 3rd chamber, this one vast beyond their ability to measure. Their lamps illuminated only the nearest walls and sections of floor. The ceiling, if there was one, disappeared into darkness that might have been 30 feet above them, or might have been 300. The chamber was so large that sounds did not echo properly, but simply faded into the distance, like words shouted into a void. And there, barely visible at the limit of their lamplight, were 2 more bodies. Brennan and Hayes. They were not lying down like Fletcher. They were standing upright, their backs to each other, positioned so that if you drew a line between them and Fletcher's location back in the previous chamber, it would form a perfect right angle. 3 points of a geometric figure stretching through multiple rooms of the cave system. Aldrich approached the two men slowly, his lamp held high. As he got closer, he saw what had been done to them, or what they had done to themselves. It was impossible to know which. Brennan and Hayes were covered in markings, not carved into their skin, but drawn with what looked like black paint or ash. Complex geometric patterns covered their faces, their hands, every inch of visible skin. The patterns were precise, mathematical, repeating symbols that seemed to have meaning, even though Aldrich could not begin to guess what that meaning might be. And their eyes. Both men's eyes were open, but there was nothing human in those eyes anymore. The irises were completely black, not the normal brown or blue or green, but an absolute light-absorbing black that seemed to extend beyond the physical eye into something deeper. They stared forward with those terrible black eyes, unblinking, unseeing, as still as statues carved from flesh. "Are they alive?" one of the men whispered. Aldrich reached out hesitantly and touched Brennan's neck. The skin was warm. The pulse beneath his fingers was slow but steady. "He is alive," Aldrich said, not quite believing his own words. "They are both alive." But were they? Could something with those black, empty eyes still be considered alive in any meaningful sense? Could something that stood motionless in absolute darkness, breathing so slowly that the movement was barely perceptible, still be called human? And if this investigation is drawing you in so far, tap that like button. It genuinely helps Appalachian Shadows bring more of these forgotten cases to light. These stories from the mountains deserve to be told. Aldrich turned to his men. "We are taking them out. All 3 of them. Fletcher, Brennan, Hayes, we carry them if we have to, but we're not leaving anyone in this cursed place." But even as he spoke, he heard it. The sound that had followed them through the passages, that wet, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across stone. It was closer now, much closer, and it was coming from multiple directions simultaneously, converging on their position from passages they had not yet explored, from holes in the cave floor they had not yet discovered, from the vast darkness above, where anything could be watching and waiting. "Form up," Aldrich commanded. "Circle formation. Lamps outward." No one looks away from their section. "If you see anything at all, you call it out immediately." The men obeyed, arranging themselves in a rough circle with Aldrich, Brennan, and Hayes at the center. Their lamps created a bubble of light perhaps 20 feet in diameter, beyond which lay absolute darkness. And in that darkness things moved. They could not see what moved. Not clearly. Just suggestions of shapes at the edge of the lamplight, fleeting impressions of forms that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. The dragging sounds grew louder, accompanied now by a clicking noise like nails on stone, rhythmic and deliberate. "Mr. Aldrich," one of the men said, his voice shaking. "Brennan." He moved. Aldrich turned. Brennan's head had rotated slightly, no longer staring straight ahead, but angled toward the largest passage exit from the chamber. And his mouth was moving. No sound emerged, but his lips formed words with careful precision. The same word over and over. Aldrich could not hear it, but he could read lips well enough to understand. "Down, down, 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 down." "What is he saying?" another man asked. "Nothing," Aldrich lied. "He is delirious. We need to move, now, back the way we came. Same formation. If anyone falls behind, we all stop. No one gets left." But even as they began to retreat, dragging and carrying the 3 unresponsive men, Aldrich knew they were not going to escape easily. Whatever lived in these caves, whatever had been disturbed by the railroad's drilling, had no intention of letting them simply walk away. It had rules, it had patterns, and it had transformed 3 experienced workers into something that was not quite human anymore. The journey back through the passages was a nightmare of controlled terror. The dragging sounds followed them constantly, sometimes from behind, sometimes from ahead, as if whatever produced those sounds was moving through passages parallel to their own route. Twice, lamps in the search party went out spontaneously, plunging sections of the group into darkness before being quickly relit by neighboring flames. When they finally emerged from the cave system into the tunnel, 8 hours after they had entered, Aldrich counted his men. All 12 were accounted for, plus the 3 they had recovered. But something was wrong. His men were not talking. They stood in the tunnel, breathing hard from exertion and fear, but they did not speak to each other. They did not ask questions or compare experiences. They simply stood, waiting for orders with an obedience that seemed almost mechanical. "Men," Aldrich said carefully. "Report, is everyone uninjured?" They nodded, all of them, perfectly synchronized nods, as if they were puppets controlled by a single hand. Fear clawed at Aldrich's throat. What had happened in those caves? What had they brought back with them, besides 3 transformed bodies? He ordered the men to carry Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes to the surface and to the camp medical tent. He followed behind, his mind racing with impossible thoughts and explanations that satisfied neither logic nor instinct. When they emerged into daylight, squinting against the afternoon sun that seemed obscenely bright after the cave darkness, he saw other workers stop their tasks and stare. The doctor who examined the 3 men could offer no explanation for their condition. Fletcher was dead, his body still impossibly warm hours after the fact, his blackened hands showing no signs of burning or chemical exposure. Brennan and Hayes were alive but unresponsive, their vital signs slow but stable, their eyes remaining open and black even when the doctor shined a bright lamp directly into them. That night, Aldrich sat in his quarters and wrote the longest journal entry of his life. He described everything they had found in the caves, every impossible detail, every violation of natural law. He wrote about the burning lamps, about the excavated shaft, about the geometric arrangement of bodies and tools. He wrote about the markings on Brennan and Hayes, about their black eyes, about the way his search party had acted after emerging from the caves. And he wrote a conclusion that he knew would not be believed, but that he believed with absolute certainty. Something is in those caves, something old, something that existed before humans walked these mountains. We disturbed it with our drilling, broke into spaces that should have remained sealed. And it took Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes, changed them, used them to communicate something I do not understand. A warning, perhaps, or an invitation. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Then he wrote, "We should stop. We should abandon this tunnel immediately, seal the entrances, and never return. But I know the company will not accept that recommendation based solely on my report. They will send investigators. They will want proof. They will want to understand what happened. And I fear what will happen when they try. Be honest with me in the comments. If you were Thomas Aldrich, would you have continued with the investigation, trying to document and understand what was happening in those caves? Or would you have walked away immediately, leaving the mystery unsolved, but potentially preventing further tragedy? Because I have thought about this a lot while researching this case. And I am still not sure there was a right answer. Aldrich sent his report to company headquarters via telegraph the next morning, using coded language to avoid panic, but conveying the essential facts. 3 men lost in the cave system, 1 dead under mysterious circumstances, 2 alive but unresponsive. Recommendation to halt all work pending full investigation. Response required urgently. The response came back within hours. Company investigators were en route. Work on the tunnel was suspended temporarily. All witnesses were to remain at the site and make themselves available for questioning. And most ominously, all written reports and journals were to be surrendered to company representatives upon their arrival. The investigators arrived 2 days later. There were 4 of them. 2 were company engineers, experienced men sent to evaluate the structural safety of the cave system and determine whether the tunnel project could proceed. The other 2 were different. They wore expensive suits, carried leather briefcases, and asked questions that had nothing to do with construction or safety. They wanted to know about the burning lamps, about the geometric arrangements, about the markings on Brennan and Hayes. They took extensive notes, and they were not surprised by anything they heard. Eldritch realized, watching these men work, that this was not the first time the railroad company had encountered something like this. They had protocols. They knew what questions to ask. They had seen similar situations before, perhaps on other construction projects in other mountains, and they had developed procedures for dealing with the inexplicable. One of the suited men, who identified himself only as Mr. Carlyle, requested a private meeting with Aldrich. They sat in Aldrich's quarters, and Carlyle opened his briefcase to reveal a stack of documents. "Foreman Aldrich, what I am about to tell you is confidential. Company property. You will not speak of it to anyone, not your workers, not your family, not even under legal compulsion. Is that understood?" Aldrich nodded slowly. "Good." Carlyle pulled out a map. It showed the Appalachian mountain range from Georgia to Maine, with dozens of locations marked in red ink. Every red mark represents a construction project where we encountered similar phenomena. Tunnels mostly, but also mines, quarries, dam excavations. Places where we dug deep into the mountains and found things that should not exist. Caves with impossible properties. Underground chambers that predate human civilization by millions of years. And sometimes we found evidence of intelligence, of design, of something that built structures deep in the earth long before humans evolved to walk upright. He pulled out another document. This one showed photographs. Blurry, poorly lit images that nevertheless clearly showed geometric patterns carved into stone, markings similar to those on Brennan and Hayes, and in one photo, something that might have been a human figure but was too distorted by shadow and overexposure to be certain. "What are they?" Aldrich asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We do not know," Carlyle replied. "We have theories. Ancient civilizations that were destroyed before they could leave surface records. Survivors of cataclysms who fled underground and evolved differently from those who remained above. Or something else entirely. Something not human at all. The theories do not matter. What matters is that they are territorial. They have rules. And when we violate those rules by drilling into their spaces, they respond. How do they respond?" Carlyle was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes they simply drive workers away. Equipment failures, sounds, and visions that frighten but do not harm. Other times they take people, transform them, use them to send messages we cannot quite interpret. And occasionally they become violent. A coal mine in Pennsylvania, a tunnel in Virginia. Entire crews lost, bodies never recovered, or recovered in conditions that no autopsy could explain. What happened to those projects? They were abandoned, sealed. The sites were purchased by shell companies and left undisturbed. Which is what will happen here, Foreman Aldrich. This tunnel project is over. We will compensate the workers, relocate the operation, and within 6 months, this entrance will be filled with concrete, and this mountain will be left alone. And Brennan and Hayes, the 2 men who are still alive? Carlyle closed his briefcase slowly. They will receive the best medical care available. They will be monitored in a private facility where specialists can study their condition and attempt to find treatment. We have others like them, 16 individuals across 7 different sites who have been transformed by exposure to whatever exists in these deep caves. Some have recovered partially, others have not, but they are cared for. That much I can promise you. And Fletcher, he will be buried with honor. His family will be compensated. The official cause of death will be listed as a cave accident. That is not quite a lie, Foreman Aldrich. He did die in a cave. We are simply omitting details that no one would believe anyway. Aldrich felt a weight settle over him. So we just walk away. Pretend this never happened. Let whatever is in those caves continue to exist undisturbed. What choice do we have? Carlyle asked. We can fight something we do not understand, lose more lives, and ultimately fail anyway. Or we can accept that some places are not meant for human intrusion, that some depths are not meant to be explored. The Appalachian Mountains have stood for millions of years, Foreman Aldrich. They will stand for millions more, and what lives beneath them will continue to live, unknown and undisturbed, as it always has. The meeting ended. Aldrich surrendered his journal as requested. though he had secretly made a copy earlier that day, hiding it in his personal trunk. He watched over the next week as the tunnel project was systematically dismantled. Equipment was removed, temporary structures were torn down. The workforce was paid out and dispersed to other projects across the railroad's expanding network. And then came the day when Carlyle's men brought in the concrete. Tons of it, mixed on site and poured into both tunnel entrances. They worked day and night for 72 hours, filling the passages with solid concrete to a depth of 200 feet, sealing the mountain, ensuring that no one could ever reach the cave system again without monumental effort. Eldridge stood and watched the final loads being poured. He thought about Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes, about the burning lamps and the geometric patterns, about the wet dragging sounds in the darkness and the things that move just beyond the reach of lamplight. And he thought about his men, his search party, who had not spoken normally since returning from the caves, who moved and acted with a synchronization that was not quite natural, who watched him sometimes with eyes that seemed darker than they had been before. What had they brought back with them besides 3 transformed bodies? What else had emerged from those caves and hitched a ride in the minds or souls of living men? The concrete hardened. The site was abandoned. Within months, vegetation began to reclaim the cleared areas. Within years, only someone who knew exactly where to look could find any evidence that a tunnel had ever been started there. The mountain swallowed the scars of human intrusion and continued its patient existence, holding its secrets close, waiting for the next time someone tried to dig too deep into spaces that were never meant to be disturbed. And somewhere in a private medical facility whose location Aldrich was never told, Brennan and Hayes stood in separate rooms, their black eyes staring at walls they did not see, their mouths occasionally forming that same word over and over in silence. Down, 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 down. Whatever was in those caves had given them a message, and they would spend the rest of their lives delivering it to no one who could understand. Thomas Aldrich returned home to his family in Charleston 3 weeks after the tunnel was sealed. He took a position with the railroad company in their main office, a desk job that kept him away from construction sites and far from the mountains. He never worked underground again. He never returned to Fayette County, and he never spoke about what happened in those caves beneath Hawks Mountain. But the nightmares came every night for the rest of his life. In his dreams, he walked endless stone passages lit by lamps that burned without oil, following chalk arrows that pointed down into depths no human had ever explored. And in those dreams, he always found Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes waiting for him, their transformed bodies arranged in perfect geometric patterns, their mouths moving in silence to form words he could almost understand. The official records of the Hawks Nest Tunnel project were sealed by the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Company in April of 1893. The company cited geological instability and unforeseen construction difficulties as the reasons for abandonment. No mention was made of the cave system, the transformed workers, or the impossible phenomena encountered during the final weeks of the project. The company absorbed the $2 million loss and moved forward with alternative routes that added years to their timeline, but avoided Hawks Mountain entirely. Fletcher was buried in the Fayette County Cemetery on March 25, 1893. His death certificate listed the cause as traumatic asphyxiation due to a cave collapse, a complete fabrication that his widow never questioned because she received a substantial compensation payment that ensured her financial security for life. At the funeral, attended by dozens of Fletcher's fellow workers, several men commented that the body in the casket did not quite look like Fletcher. The face was right, the build was right, but something about the expression was wrong, as if the corpse was wearing Fletcher's features like a mask, but had never learned to arrange them quite correctly. The casket was closed quickly, and no one spoke of their observations aloud. But the rumor spread quietly through the camp that what they had buried was not entirely James Fletcher, that some essential part of him had remained in those caves, and what lay in the cemetery was just the shell he had worn in life. Brennan and Hayes were transferred to a private medical facility in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, operated by a company with financial ties to the railroad. The facility specialized in industrial accident cases, treating workers who had been injured in ways that required long-term care or rehabilitation. But it also housed a special wing, never mentioned in any official documentation, where patients with unusual conditions were kept under close observation. Aldrich learned about this wing years later through a chance encounter with one of Carlisle's associates. The wing contained 16 patients when Brennan and Hayes arrived, all of them workers who'd been transformed by exposure to similar phenomena in various deep excavation projects. They ranged in age from 19 to 62. They came from 6 different states, and they all shared certain characteristics. The black eyes, the strange markings that appeared on their skin in geometric patterns, the tendency to stand motionless for hours, breathing so slowly that attendants sometimes had to check pulses to confirm they were still alive, and the compulsion to speak the same words over and over. For some, the word was down. For others, it was different words, deeper, below, underneath, the old places. Before, words that suggested direction, depth, and antiquity, as if whatever had transformed these men was trying to communicate through them, but lacked the ability to form complex sentences in human language. Or perhaps lacked the desire to be more clear. The medical staff at the facility could do nothing for them. There was no injury to treat, no disease to cure, no poison to purge from their systems. Physically, the men were healthy. Their hearts beat, their lungs drew breath, their bodies processed food and maintained themselves. But mentally, spiritually, whatever you wanted to call the essence that made a person human, they were gone, or transformed so completely that they might as well be gone. Brennan died in 1907, 14 years after his transformation. He simply stopped breathing one night, his heart ceasing to beat, his body finally giving up its strange vigil. The autopsy revealed nothing unusual except for one detail. His internal organs were covered in microscopic markings similar to those that had appeared on his skin. Tiny geometric patterns etched into his liver, his kidneys, his heart, as if whatever had changed him had rewritten his body at a fundamental level, leaving messages in his flesh that no one could interpret. Hayes lasted longer. He remained in the facility until 1923, a full 30 years after entering the caves. His black eyes never changed. The markings on his skin slowly faded over the years, but never disappeared entirely. He never spoke a word other than down, repeated endlessly in a whisper that attendants reported could be heard even when his mouth was closed. When he finally died, the facility quietly cremated his body against standard protocol. Whatever Hayes had become, someone decided it should not be preserved or studied further. The search party that had accompanied Aldrich into the caves fared better, at least on the surface. All 12 men returned to normal work within weeks of the tunnel's sealing. They were reassigned to other projects, and most went on to have successful careers with the railroad company. But those who knew them well noticed changes. They had become quieter, less social. They worked with a mechanical efficiency that impressed supervisors but disturbed their fellow workers. And sometimes, particularly on moonless nights or in enclosed spaces, their eyes would seem darker than they should be. Not quite the black of Brennan and Hayes, but something approaching it. Something wrong. 3 of the 12 died in industrial accidents over the following decade. Falls from high structures, crushing injuries from heavy equipment, drownings in rivers where the water was shallow and the weather was calm. Accidents that should not have been fatal, but somehow were. Accidents that happened when the men were alone, with no witnesses to explain what had gone wrong. The remaining 9 lived longer, but not better. 2 ended their own lives, leaving no notes or explanations. 3 developed progressive mental deterioration in their 40s and 50s, descending into confused states where they spoke of caves and depths and things that waited in the darkness beneath the world. The final 4 lived into old age, but all of them requested cremation in their wills with specific instructions that their ashes be scattered on mountains, never buried in the earth. It was as if they could not bear the thought of being underground again, even in death. Thomas Aldrich retired from the railroad company in 1912 at the age of 61. He had served with distinction for 40 years, supervising dozens of successful projects after the Hawk's Nest disaster. But everyone who worked with him noted that he was different after 1893, more cautious, more hesitant to push crews into difficult or dangerous situations, and absolutely adamant that no project under his supervision would involve deep cave exploration or drilling through unknown underground spaces. In his retirement, Aldrich devoted himself to recording his experiences. He had kept the secret copy of his original journal, the one that described everything that had happened in the caves beneath Hawk's Mountain. He expanded it, adding details he remembered, correlating it with information he gathered over the years through careful networking with others who had encountered similar phenomena. By 1915, his journal had grown to more than 300 pages, a comprehensive account of industrial encounters with what he called the old underground across multiple states and decades. He also compiled a list, locations where similar incidents had occurred. Mines in Pennsylvania, where entire shifts of workers disappeared without explanation. Quarries in Tennessee, where equipment failures and strange phenomena drove companies to abandon profitable operations. Construction projects in North Carolina, where workers reported seeing impossible structures in underwater caves. Subway tunnel excavations in major cities, where sections were quietly redirected to avoid areas that produced unexplained problems. The list contained 87 locations by the time of Aldrich's death in 1919. He left instructions that his journal and the list should be given to his eldest son, with orders to continue updating it and to use the information to prevent future tragedies. But when his son read the journal, he made a different decision. He burned it. He burned the journal, the list, all of his father's research and documentation. He told his siblings that their father had become obsessed with delusions in his old age, that the stress of his work had broken something in his mind, and that preserving these writings would only tarnish the memory of a good man. Better to let the past remain in the past, better to forget. But he had not burned everything. One copy of the core journal, the original account of what happened at Hawk's Nest, had been hidden separately in a trunk that went to Aldrich's daughter. She never read it, never even opened the sealed envelope that contained it. When she died in 1947, the trunk passed to her daughter, who finally opened the envelope in 1962 and discovered her grandfather's testimony. That granddaughter, Elizabeth Aldrich Morrison, was a professor of Appalachian history at West Virginia University. She recognized immediately the historical significance of the document, but she also recognized the sensitive nature of its contents. Railroad companies were still powerful. The families of the men involved might not want their ancestors' stories told, and the contents of the journal were so extraordinary that publishing them might destroy her academic credibility. She made copies of the journal and deposited them in 3 separate archives with instructions that they not be opened until 60 years after the incident, which would be 1953, or 60 years after Aldrich's death, which would be 1979, whichever came first. She chose repositories that specialized in Appalachian history and industrial archaeology, ensuring that the information would eventually reach researchers who could approach it with appropriate context. The first archive was opened in 1953 as scheduled. The journal's contents immediately sparked controversy. Some historians dismissed it as fiction or the product of a traumatized mind. Others recognized parallels with folk traditions and legends about underground places throughout Appalachian culture. A few researchers became obsessed with verifying the account and traveled to Fayette County to search for the sealed tunnel. They found evidence, not of the tunnel itself, which remained buried under tons of concrete and decades of plant growth, but of its existence. County records from 1891 through 1893 showed substantial railroad company expenditures in the region. Property deeds indicated that the company had purchased extensive land rights near Hawks Mountain during that period, and elderly residents remembered stories passed down from grandparents about a tunnel project that was suddenly abandoned after workers died in mysterious circumstances. One researcher, a graduate student named Michael Patterson, located the grave of James Fletcher. With permission from Fletcher's descendants, he arranged for a modern examination of the burial site using ground-penetrating radar. The results were peculiar. The radar images showed a casket-shaped object at the expected depth, but the density readings were inconsistent with a normal human burial. Something was in that grave, but whatever it was, it did not have the mass distribution of a human body. Patterson applied for permission to exhume the remains for proper study. Permission was denied by multiple authorities for various reasons. The family did not want the disturbance. The cemetery board cited preservation concerns. And finally, and most mysteriously, a letter arrived from a law firm representing an anonymous client who claimed to have a legal interest in keeping the grave undisturbed. The letter included a substantial financial offer to Patterson personally if he would abandon the exhumation effort. Patterson was a dedicated researcher, but not a wealthy man. He accepted the offer. He also ceased all research related to the Hawks Nest Tunnel. When asked by colleagues why he had given up on such a promising project, he would only say that he had come to believe some investigations were not worth pursuing, that some questions were better left unanswered. The second archive copy of Aldrich's journal was opened in 1979. By this time, the railroad company that had built the tunnel no longer existed, having been absorbed through various mergers and bankruptcies into larger corporate entities. No one currently alive had any direct connection to the original project. The legal and ethical barriers that had prevented discussion of the incident had largely disappeared. Several documentaries were produced about the Hawks Nest Tunnel, exploring it as an example of industrial cover-ups and the suppression of worker safety concerns. The stranger elements of Aldrich's account were generally downplayed or presented as possible psychological trauma responses to a genuine disaster. The burning lamps became equipment malfunctions. The transformed workers became victims of toxic gas exposure or some unknown neurological condition. The cave system, with its impossible properties, became a normal limestone cave that happened to contain dangerous atmospheric conditions. The documentaries were well received and sparked renewed interest in Appalachian industrial history. But they also inspired something else. A small community of researchers, explorers, and enthusiasts who believed the strange elements of Aldrich's account were literally true. They called themselves cave researchers or industrial archaeologists or historical preservationists. But their real interest was in finding and exploring the underground spaces that had transformed Fletcher. Brennan and Hayes. Several expeditions were mounted to locate the sealed tunnel entrances. Most found nothing. The concrete seals had been placed so far back into the mountain that locating them required extensive excavation, and most explorers lacked the resources or legal permission to conduct such operations. But in 1987, a group of 4 experienced cavers claimed to have found an entrance. They reported discovering a small natural opening on the north face of Hawks Mountain that appeared to connect to the sealed tunnel system. They entered with modern equipment, lights, ropes, communications devices, and GPS locators. They were gone for 6 hours. When they emerged, they immediately drove to the nearest town and demanded to speak with law enforcement. Their story was confused and contradictory. They claimed to have found the tunnel, but also said it was not how Aldrich had described it. They spoke of chambers that changed size, of passages that seemed to lead in physically impossible directions, of markings on walls that moved when you were not looking directly at them. And they spoke of finding objects, modern objects, items that should not exist in a tunnel sealed in 1893, flashlights, clothing, a digital watch. Evidence that others had been in those caves recently. Evidence that whatever lived there was still active. The four cavers returned to the site 3 days later with additional equipment and a news crew from a regional television station. The news crew recorded footage of the cave entrance, interviews with the cavers, and the beginning of their descent into the opening. Then the footage ended abruptly. Search and rescue teams were dispatched when the group did not return. They found the news crew's van parked near the cave entrance. They found equipment scattered around the opening. They found the camera still recording, its battery nearly dead, showing 9 hours of footage pointing at a rock wall inside the cave entrance. But they did not find any of the 7 people who had entered. An extensive search of the cave system was conducted over 3 weeks, involving professional rescue teams, geologists, and law enforcement. They mapped several miles of passages and chambers. They found no trace of the missing 7, and they found something else. Multiple passages appeared to have been recently sealed with concrete, not the old, weathered concrete from 1893, but fresh material that had been poured within the past few decades. Someone had been maintaining the seals. Someone had been going into those caves and closing off passages that should have remained inaccessible. Someone who did not want anyone to reach whatever was in the deeper chambers. The cave entrance was officially sealed by the county government in 1988. Chain link fencing was installed, warning signs were posted, and quietly, discreetly, private security was hired to patrol the area and prevent unauthorized entry. The security was funded by an anonymous donor who provided enough money to maintain the patrol indefinitely. The missing 7 were never found. Their disappearances were classified as accidental deaths due to cave-related hazards, though no bodies were ever recovered. The families received compensation from various insurance policies and from an anonymous charitable trust that appeared specifically to support the surviving relatives of people lost in industrial or historical research accidents. The footage from the news camera was reviewed extensively by investigators. Most of it showed nothing useful, just 9 hours of a static view of a rock wall. But in the final few minutes before the battery died, something appeared in the frame. A figure walking past the camera, too distant and blurry to identify clearly, but definitely human in general shape, definitely moving with purpose, and definitely walking deeper into the cave, away from the entrance, into darkness that the camera's light could not penetrate. One of the investigators who reviewed that footage was a retired police detective named Arthur Brennan, the great-grandson of William Brennan, who had been transformed in the caves a century earlier. Arthur had spent his career investigating cold cases and missing persons. When he saw that figure in the footage, he felt something he had rarely experienced in 40 years of police work: recognition. He could not explain why. The figure was too indistinct, too poorly lit. It could have been anyone. But something in the way it moved, something in its posture and gait, struck Arthur as terribly familiar, as if he had seen that walk before. Perhaps in dreams he could not quite remember, perhaps in genetic memories passed down through generations of his family. Arthur Brennan closed the case file and submitted his report. Accidental deaths due to cave hazards. No criminal activity suspected. Investigation complete. But he also made a personal decision. He would never go near Hawks Mountain. He would never research the old tunnel project. He would discourage his children and grandchildren from taking any interest in Appalachian cave systems or industrial history. Some family legacies, he decided, were best left forgotten. The Hawks Nest Tunnel remains sealed today. The concrete barriers placed in 1893 are still there, now more than a century old, buried under earth and vegetation and the slow accumulation of time. The cave system behind those barriers continues to exist, its chambers and passages unchanged by the decades, its impossible properties undiminished, its secrets preserved in darkness that has remained unbroken except for brief, disastrous intrusions by those who did not understand what they were disturbing. The mountains stand, patient, ancient, holding their mysteries close, and deep beneath Hawks Mountain, in chambers that no map has ever charted, in spaces that existed before the first humans walked the Appalachian ridges, something waits. Something that transformed Fletcher, Brennan, and Hayes. Something that took 7 modern explorers and left no trace of their passage. Something that burns lamps without oil, arranges bodies in geometric patterns, and communicates through symbols that human minds cannot quite process. It waits, as it has always waited, as it will continue to wait, long after everyone who remembers this story has died and the story itself has faded into legend and myth. Because that is what the old underground does, it waits. And occasionally, when humans dig too deep, when curiosity or greed or simple misfortune brings people into spaces they should not enter, it reaches out. It transforms, it takes, and it sends the changed ones back to the surface, not as warnings exactly, but as messages. Communications from something so old and so different from human life that its very existence challenges our understanding of what is possible. Thomas Aldrich understood this in his final years. He wrote in one of his last journal entries, just months before his death, "We think we know these mountains. We map them, name them, drill through them, as if they are simply obstacles to be overcome. But the mountains were here long before us. They will be here long after us. And what lives in their deepest places has a patience that makes human lifespans seem like moments. Human civilizations seem like brief dreams. We are visitors in their world. And we would do well to remember that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some depths once explored cannot be forgotten. Some transformations once begun cannot be undone. Fletcher died transformed. Brennan died transformed. Hayes died transformed. And somewhere, perhaps still standing in rooms that no one has found, perhaps moving through passages that connect to the surface in ways no map could show, are others. The 7 who vanished in 1987. The 3 from Aldrich's search party who died in strange accidents. Others whose stories were never recorded, whose transformations happened so long ago that no record survived, whose names are forgotten, but whose changed bodies might still exist in some form, in those timeless caves beneath the mountains. What are they doing down there? Are they aware? Do they suffer? Do they serve some purpose in the ecology of that ancient underground? We cannot know. We can only acknowledge that they exist somewhere in the darkness, part of something we do not understand and perhaps were never meant to understand. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person Appalachian Shadows exists for. Someone who does not turn away from the darkness. Someone who wants to understand the truth buried in these mountains, no matter how disturbing. Next week, I'm bringing you the story of the vanished logging camp in eastern Kentucky, where 40 men disappeared in a single night in 1906. And the only clue was a symbol carved into every tree in a perfect mile-wide circle around their camp. And that case? It makes this one look tame. Subscribe to Appalachian Shadows now and turn on notifications, because these stories from the hollows and ridges do not stay buried forever. One more thing. I know many of you watching are from West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Appalachian country. If your family has stories like this, cases that were hushed up, construction projects that were suddenly abandoned, workers who changed after going underground, secrets that were buried in the hollows, share them in the comments. You do not have to use names, just the story, because I read every single comment. And your stories might become the next investigation here on Appalachian Shadows.